Colonel Oscar Koch spread intelligence reports across the conference table at 3rd Army Headquarters in Nancy, France. December 9, 1944. Outside, staff officers hurried through cold rain preparing for the massive offensive scheduled to begin in 10 days. Inside this room, Koch was about to tell Lieutenant General George Patton something no one else in the Allied command believed. The Germans were coming. Koch pointed to reconnaissance photos showing troop concentrations east of Aachen. 6th Panzer Army. Freshly equipped divisions pulled from the Eastern Front. Veteran SS units that should have been committed to defending the Siegfried Line but weren't. Radio traffic showing command restructuring. Fuel dumps being positioned behind supposedly defensive positions. 3rd Army intelligence had been tracking these movements since November. Every week the buildup grew larger. Every week Koch's reports grew more urgent. And every week Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force dismissed them. Koch looked at Patton. In such a scenario, he said, the enemy was favored. The room went quiet. Patton stood. He told the group they would be in a position to meet whatever happens. 3rd Army would continue planning the Frankfurt offensive. But starting immediately, his staff would begin contingency planning. If the Germans attacked north of their position, 3rd Army needed to be ready to turn 90 degrees and strike. 7 days later, at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the largest German offensive on the Western Front exploded across the Ardennes. 29 divisions, 250,000 men, 12 armored divisions. The assault crashed through thinly held American positions in Belgium and Luxembourg with such force that entire battalions disintegrated in hours. Foggy weather grounded Allied aircraft. German panzers drove west toward the Meuse River. The goal was Antwerp. Split the Allied armies. Force a negotiated peace. At 1st Army Headquarters, chaos. Radio communications collapsed as German commandos cut telephone lines. Unit positions unknown. Casualty reports fragmentary. The scope of the disaster unclear. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, shock. Eisenhower's intelligence chief had predicted a quiet sector. Bradley had called it a calculated risk. Montgomery was planning his own offensive toward the Rhine. No one had positioned reserves to counter a major attack through the Ardennes, except Patton. On the morning of December 18th, Bradley summoned Patton to Luxembourg and displayed the situation on a map. The German penetration was far deeper than anyone had realized. Entire divisions encircled. Supply routes severed. American forces streaming west in retreat. Bradley asked what 3rd Army could do. Patton replied immediately. 2 divisions moving within 24 hours. A third if necessary. The answer stunned Bradley. 3rd Army was engaged in heavy fighting near Saarbrücken. Patton's forces faced east toward Germany, fully committed to the Frankfurt offensive. Turning an entire army 90 degrees in winter weather across 150 miles of icy roads while maintaining combat operations should have taken weeks. Patton said he could do it in 2 days. That evening Patton briefed his staff at Nancy. He explained that 3rd Army would be called to relieve 1st Army. How and where would be decided at Verdun the next morning. Before leaving for that meeting, Patton gave final instructions. His staff already had 3 complete operational plans ready. Plan Nickel, Plan Cent, Plan Dime. Each detailed a different axis of attack northward. Each specified which divisions would move, which routes they would take, how fuel would be positioned, where supply dumps would be relocated, movement schedules, communication protocols, artillery coordination. Every detail worked out in advance, because Oscar Koch had warned them a week earlier. On the morning of December 19th, Eisenhower convened an emergency conference at Verdun. The meeting took place in a bare second-floor room of a French stone barracks. A pot-bellied stove provided minimal warmth against the December chill. Most officers kept their coats on. The mood was grim. Eisenhower arrived looking grave, almost ashen. Bradley waited upstairs. British Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers. Staff officers clustered around situation maps showing the massive German Bulge driving into Allied lines. Eisenhower told his generals that the present situation was to be regarded as one of opportunity and not of disaster. The Germans had come out from behind their fortifications. Allied forces could destroy them in the open. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the critical question: when could Third Army attack north to relieve the surrounded forces? Patton replied without hesitation, "As soon as you're through with me, I can attack the day after tomorrow morning." Some officers laughed. Others thought Patton was being flippant or boastful. Eisenhower himself accused Patton of being fatuous. A 2-day turnaround was impossible. Third Army was fighting on a completely different front. Disengaging from combat, repositioning, and launching a coordinated offensive required careful planning. Eisenhower asked how many divisions Patton could commit. Patton replied that he could attack with 2 divisions within 48 hours. Unknown to everyone in that room, Patton had left 3 contingency plans with his Deputy Major General Hobart Gay back in Nancy. All he needed to do was telephone a code word to activate the movements. His staff had already identified fuel routes, prepared movement schedules, coordinated with supply units. While other Allied commanders had spent December planning their own offensives, assuming the Ardennes was quiet, Patton had prepared for exactly this crisis. The preparation went deeper than operational plans. While Koch closely noted signs of German buildup, Third Army was planning measures to counter any potential threat in the Ardennes. Not theoretical planning, concrete preparation. Third Army quartermasters had prepositioned additional fuel stocks. Engineers had mapped routes north. Communications officers had established relay points. Logistics officers had calculated tonnage requirements for sustained operations in a new sector. This wasn't luck. It was professional military preparation based on intelligence other commands had ignored. Where others at Verdun came with only vague ideas and without specific plans, Patton had devised 3 plans beforehand, each tailored to meet any contingency that Eisenhower and Bradley might direct. Eisenhower gave the order. Third Army would attack north with 3 divisions to break through to Bastogne, the critical road junction town that German forces were moving to encircle. By midnight on December 19th, the movement had begun. The 4th Armored Division started rolling north toward Longwy. The 80th Infantry Division moved toward Luxembourg City. The 26th Infantry Division prepared to follow. Across the entire Third Army sector, over 133,000 soldiers, 11,000 vehicles, and hundreds of tanks began executing one of the most difficult maneuvers in modern warfare. A 90-degree pivot under combat conditions in winter. The roads were sheets of ice. Snow fell heavily. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Convoys stretched for miles. In some sectors, troops had to disengage from active combat with German forces to their front, pull back, reorient, and move north while German units tried to exploit the withdrawal. Supply units worked around the clock repositioning ammunition, fuel, and rations. Engineers cleared routes and reinforced bridges. Signal companies strung new communication lines. Every staff section executed portions of the contingency plans that had been prepared days earlier. The entire operation should have dissolved into chaos. Unit boundaries overlapped. Traffic jams should have paralyzed movement. Supply lines should have snapped. Communication should have broken down. But Patton's staff had wargamed these problems. They had calculated movement rates. They had identified choke points and planned alternatives. When the 4th Armored Division covered 150 miles in 19 hours, it wasn't improvisation. It was execution of a plan that existed before the German attack began. On December 22nd, 3 days after the Verdun Conference, Third Army attacked. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, drove north from Arlon toward Bastogne. The division organized into 3 combat commands that operated as combined arms task forces: tanks, armored infantry, self-propelled artillery, engineers, and tank destroyers integrated into flexible formations that could respond to rapidly changing tactical situations. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion. His unit spearheaded Combat Command Reserve. On Christmas Day, with Bastogne still surrounded and the 101st Airborne Division running critically low on ammunition and medical supplies, Abrams began the final push. The Germans defending the approaches to Bastogne knew the relief column was coming. They positioned anti-tank guns along the roads. They fortified villages. They prepared ambushes. The 5th Parachute Division and elements of Panzer Lehr Division held defensive positions south and southwest of the town. Abrams attacked through Remy-Champagne on the morning of December 26th. His tanks pushed through German resistance using a technique of overwhelming violence. Artillery saturated defensive positions. Tank destroyers provided covering fire. Armored infantry dismounted to clear strong points. Then the tanks rolled forward. At the village of Eisenhower, 5 miles from Bastogne, the Germans made their strongest stand. The town sat on high ground commanding the road. German infantry occupied stone buildings. Anti-tank guns covered the approaches. Abrams made a calculated decision. Instead of methodical clearing operations that would take hours, he would punch straight through. Speed over caution. Artillery would suppress the defenders. Tanks would drive through the village. Armored infantry following behind would clear remaining resistance. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26, 1944, 1st Lieutenant Charles Bulge commanded the lead tank. Sherman number USA 306-7441. The crew had painted Cobra King on the turret. Bulge radioed his intention to make a dash for Bastogne. Artillery fire walked ahead of the column. Cobra King's engine roared as it accelerated through Eisenhower. German small arms fire ricocheted off the armor. An anti-tank round missed by feet. Bulge kept the throttle open. The tank broke through the German line and raced up the road toward Bastogne. Behind Cobra King, the rest of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion followed. German defenders in Eisenhower found themselves bypassed, with American armor in their rear and American infantry closing from the front. At 4:50 p.m., the spearhead reached the lines of the 326th Engineers on December 26th, Cobra King being the first tank to make contact at approximately 1650. Bulge climbed out of his tank and shook hands with 1st Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 101st Airborne Division. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The corridor was narrow and would require widening. Fighting would continue for weeks. But 3rd Army had reached the surrounded garrison in exactly 7 days from the Verdun Conference. Patton had promised Eisenhower he could attack in 2 days. On December 22nd, 3 days after Verdun, 3rd Army launched its offensive. 4 days later, on December 26th, the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The relief cost the 4th Armored Division approximately 1,000 casualties. The 37th Tank Battalion lost 5 killed, 22 wounded, and 5 missing. But they had accomplished what no other Allied unit was positioned to attempt. German commanders were stunned by the speed of 3rd Army's response. For months, German intelligence had tracked Allied movements and assessed Allied capabilities. They knew 3rd Army was positioned far to the south. They knew Patton was preparing an offensive toward Frankfurt. They had calculated that any Allied response to the Ardennes offensive would take at least 2 weeks to organize. 3rd Army attacked in less than a week. German forces attempting to capture Bastogne suddenly found themselves fighting on 2 fronts. Panzers that should have been driving west toward the Meuse were pulled back to contain the American breakthrough from the south. The entire southern shoulder of the German offensive stalled as divisions were diverted to face Patton. By early January, the German offensive had collapsed. American and British forces compressed the Bulge from north and south. The weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned to the skies. German armor that penetrated deepest into Belgium found itself cut off and destroyed. Units that had begun the offensive with full strength limped back to Germany as shadows. Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed. The Ardennes offensive cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties and destroyed the armored reserve that might have defended against the coming Allied offensives into Germany itself. The battle demonstrated something beyond tactical skill or operational planning. It revealed the difference between competent military leadership and exceptional professional preparation. Other Allied commanders were surprised by the German offensive because they relied on assumptions. The Ardennes was defensive terrain. The Germans were depleted. Winter weather made large-scale operations impossible. These assumptions felt reasonable. They matched Allied preconceptions about German capabilities in late 1944. Oskar Koch didn't rely on assumptions. He analyzed intelligence reports, tracked unit movements, and identified patterns that contradicted the prevailing wisdom. When evidence showed German armor concentrating opposite a quiet sector, he reported it. When fuel dumps appeared behind supposedly defensive positions, he noted it. When radio intercepts indicated command reorganization, he investigated. Koch understood that intelligence work required intellectual honesty. It meant reporting what the evidence showed, not what headquarters wanted to hear. It meant being willing to contradict senior officers. It meant accepting that you might be wrong but insisting that the data be examined. Patton understood something equally important. He understood that intelligence assessments were worthless unless commanders acted on them. He could have dismissed Koch's warnings like every other Allied headquarters did. He could have insisted that the Frankfurt offensive took priority. He could have waited for definitive proof before preparing contingencies. Instead, Patton ordered his staff to plan for a German offensive that intelligence suggested but couldn't prove. He committed resources to preparations that might never be needed. He accepted the risk of looking foolish if Koch's assessment was wrong. When Koch laid out the possibility of an enemy counteroffensive with all of the known enemy combat strength and told Patton that in such a scenario the enemy was favored, Patton didn't argue or minimize. He ordered preparations. The contingency planning Third Army conducted between December 9th and December 16th made the difference between 7 days and 3 weeks. Without those plans, Third Army would have needed time to conduct reconnaissance, identify routes, coordinate movements, and position supplies. Units would have moved piecemeal. Attacks would have been uncoordinated. The relief of Bastogne would have come too late. Instead, when Eisenhower asked when Patton could attack, the answer was ready because the work had already been done. This pattern appears throughout Patton's career. Aggressive execution supported by meticulous preparation. Bold tactical decisions backed by detailed staff work. Public confidence rooted in private planning. The mythology around Patton emphasizes his personality and his rhetoric. The historical reality shows a professional officer who understood that successful operations required logistics, intelligence, and planning. At Verdun, Eisenhower didn't know about the contingency plans. Bradley didn't know. The other generals in that cold barracks room didn't know. They saw Patton's promise to attack in 2 days as bravado. They didn't see the week of preparation that made the promise possible. Historian Martin Blumenson wrote that this was the sublime moment of Patton's career. After more than 34 years in the Army, destiny had groomed him for this single defining instant. While near panic existed elsewhere, in Third Army there was belief that a magnificent opportunity existed to strike a killing blow. That opportunity existed because one intelligence officer raised the alarm and one commanding general listened. The Battle of the Bulge inflicted over 75,000 American casualties. The 101st Airborne Division's casualties from December 19, 1944 to January 6, 1945 were 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Thousands more suffered from exposure, frostbite, and combat fatigue in the bitter winter conditions. But the German objective failed completely. Antwerp remained in Allied hands. The Allied armies stayed united. The German armored reserve was destroyed. Within 3 months, Allied forces would cross the Rhine and drive into Germany's heartland. The war in Europe would end on May 8, 1945. Patton continued commanding Third Army through the final campaigns of the war. His forces crossed the Rhine, liberated concentration camps, and drove deep into Czechoslovakia and Bavaria. Third Army would compile one of the most aggressive operational records of any army in the European theater. On December 9, 1945, Patton was seriously injured in a traffic accident near Mannheim, Germany. He died of his injuries on December 21, 12 days later. He was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg among the soldiers of Third Army. Oskar Koch survived the war and retired as a brigadier general. His intelligence work during the Battle of the Bulge received little public recognition at the time. Military historians studying the campaign later identified his assessment as one of the rare intelligence successes of the battle. Most historical accounts describe the Battle of the Bulge as a massive intelligence failure. That characterization is accurate for Allied intelligence generally, but it misses the critical exception. One intelligence officer got it right. One commanding general acted on that intelligence. That combination saved weeks and possibly saved Bastogne. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Military organizations face a persistent tension between what commanders want intelligence to say and what evidence actually shows. Organizational cultures often punish intelligence analysts who deliver unwelcome assessments. Career advancement goes to officers who align with command expectations. Koch's accurate prediction came from intellectual independence. He analyzed data without regard for what SHAEF wanted to hear. He reported conclusions that contradicted the prevailing optimism at Allied headquarters. He insisted on the integrity of the intelligence process even when that made him unpopular. Patton's response demonstrated professional leadership. He didn't shoot the messenger. He didn't dismiss the warning because it disrupted his plans. He didn't wait for certainty before preparing. He acted on probability and made sure his army was ready. That readiness made the difference between disaster and recovery in December 1944. The contingency plans weren't complicated. They were professional military staff work. Route reconnaissance, movement calculations, logistics coordination, communication planning. Every staff officer in the Allied armies had been trained to conduct this type of planning. The difference was that Third Army actually did it while other headquarters assumed the Ardennes would stay quiet. The preparation didn't require genius. It required taking intelligence seriously and being willing to prepare for a scenario that contradicted optimistic assumptions. On December 26, 1944, when Cobra King crashed through to Bastogne, the corridor was only a few hundred yards wide. German forces immediately counterattacked, trying to close it. For days, convoys moving to Bastogne required armored escorts. The fighting around the town would continue into January. But the siege was broken because one army had been ready to respond. Patton wasn't the only capable general in the Allied command. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Montgomery all commanded successfully throughout the campaign in Europe. They had different strengths and different styles. But in mid-December 1944, when the crisis came, only Patton was ready. Ready because his intelligence officer had warned him. Ready because he had listened to that warning. Ready because he had ordered his staff to plan. Ready because those plans were detailed and executable. Ready because preparation had been done before the emergency arrived. The Battle of the Bulge was the last major German offensive of World War II. It delayed the Allied advance by several weeks. It inflicted heavy casualties. It demonstrated that the Wehrmacht retained formidable fighting capability even in the final months of the war. But it also demonstrated that professional military preparation could overcome surprise and crisis. That intelligence work mattered. That staff planning mattered. That logistics and coordination mattered. That readiness came from doing the unglamorous work before the crisis arrived. On December 19, 1944, in that cold room in Verdun, when Eisenhower asked when Third Army could attack, Patton could answer immediately because the answer had been prepared days earlier. Other generals came with intentions. Patton came with plans. That was why Third Army was ready when no one else was. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. The difference between success and failure often came down to preparation that no one saw and decisions made before the crisis began. If you want to hear more forgotten chapters of history, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Drop a comment telling us which World War II story you want to hear next.